Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the world, and welcome back to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and you guys are tuned in to Season 2, Episode 10, The Black Knight Satellite, Decoded. If the title didn't clue you in enough tonight, we will be doing a deep dive into the enigmatic origins and proposed history surrounding the object that has come to be known as the Black Knight Satellite. From early reports to the most recent revelations, tonight we endeavor to sort fact from fiction, reality from myth, and hopefully take the most detailed, open, and honest look possible into the truth about the Black Knight. I've also posted a series of images over on the Facebook page, as well as in the Discord, so if you'd like to follow along with us, there is also a visual component to this evening's show. This is just one of those stories that I figured it would be easier to tell when you can actually see for yourself what it is that I'm describing in a lot of these parts. Anyways, that's all for the prelude tonight. Keep it short and get right into it. We've got a lot to cover, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and kick it off with Part 1, Echoes. What is the Black Knight Satellite? That question seemingly has no definitive answer, but more than enough speculation and half-truths, misquotes, and outright fabrication to go around. Even its name, it would seem, stems from confusion. By most accounts, its name was derived from conflating the satellite with a British rocket that was called Black Knight. And it was used in conjunction with the Blue Streak missile program between the years of 1958 and 1965. They were testing re-entry vehicles. There was also a Black Knight satellite launcher project announced back in 1964, but by all accounts that program never managed to put anything into orbit. Due to several earlier reports labeling the object a quote dark satellite, it is thought that the two things somehow just became conflated around this time. Two people we have previously covered in this show also appear in the mythos around the Black Knight, those being Nikola Tesla and John Keel. We will get to Keel in a bit, but first let's take a look at how Tesla figures into this story. Shortly after setting up his lab in Colorado Springs, he built, among other things, a large magnifying transmitter to better research and try to understand wireless power distribution. Shortly after, he would begin receiving mysterious signals on his equipment, which he at the time interpreted as being from alien origins. Perhaps that thought stemmed from, or was at least reinforced by, an invention that he had made 3 years prior in 1896, which was a wireless transmitter that he believed could one day be used to send communications to life forms on other planets. Tesla would translate the incoming signals as some form of numeric code. It was coming in a series of repeating numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, which he believed at the time to be coming from what he called, quote, highly intelligent beings on Mars. Years later, proponents of the BKS theory would retroactively fit this interaction into being the first time that the satellite had tried to communicate with humanity. Modern skeptics, however, have attributed this incident to having come from pulsars more than likely, something that wasn't to be identified until 1968. Even Tesla rival Marconi would also notice these transmissions around the same time, but his report was dismissed more readily than Tesla's as simply being some sort of interference. While it is difficult to say with total certainty what these signals truly were, the common explanation and scientifically accepted theory remains to be quasars or some similar type of interstellar radio interference. Regardless, this incident is frequently cited as being the first known interaction with the BKS. It would be nearly 30 years later, in 1928, before signals of this sort would once again cause a stir in the press. Jørgen Hals was a civil engineer in Oslo, Norway. In the early days of commercial radio, Jørgen would become fascinated with this new novel technology and decided to pick one up so that he could listen to shortwave radio transmissions coming from a station over in Eindhoven. One night as he was listening in, he began to notice something strange, something that struck him as being very unusual. The radio signals were seemingly being reflected back by something, causing echoes. While it was fairly well known, even at this point, that shortwave radio signals would often bounce around between the ground and the stratosphere in a phenomenon that is known as propagation. This would manifest as a delayed echo. What struck him as odd about these was the timing. Typically, radio echoes would be heard about 1/7 of a second after the transmission, but these echoes behaved differently, arriving at irregular intervals, with some occurring at 3 seconds, some at 15, in varying length and varying patterns. These would come to be known as long delay echoes, and their discovery would leave scientists puzzled to this day. To many, the only answer lies in the BKS and it rebroadcasting the signals in an attempt to communicate with mankind. These LDEs would make an appearance once again in possibly the strangest part of our story in 1973. But first, Part 2, Sightings. While once again any sort of related coverage would die down in the ensuing years, another event would occur in 1954 that would put the majority of the U.S. on edge. A story would appear in a technology magazine called Aviation Week and Space Technology, as well as in the May 14th edition of the San Francisco Examiner, among others, that would detail the discovery of what was believed to be 1 or 2 satellites in Earth's orbit. This was reported by a major in the Marines by the name of Donald Kehoe, who at this time had just wrapped up a respected career as a naval aviator. It would even appear in the New York Times, Time magazine, and other notable publications. While Major Kehoe is typically dismissed by skeptics as just being a UFO researcher, which he would go on to become, as well as founding the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP. He was first a naval aviator and a well-respected serviceman. The article would report that 1 or possibly 2 objects had been spotted by government scientists from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and that they had appeared to be satellites of artificial origin, and that they are continuing attempts to track these objects. In follow-up articles, it would be revealed that they were indeed 2 satellites moving along at 400 and 600 miles respectively above the Earth, and they were emitting some sort of radio signal, once again at irregular intervals. There was enough interest in these objects for the University of New Mexico to put together a project team led by astronomer Lincoln La Paz in an attempt to figure out exactly where and what these satellites actually were. Bear in mind, this was nearly 3 years before the Soviets would manage to successfully launch the first man-made satellite into orbit with Sputnik, so there was definitely a lot of concern for exactly who the satellites were working on behalf of. They were also reportedly spotted by the U.S. Air Force as well as the Venezuelan Communications Ministry a few years later while tracking Sputnik. Perhaps what stood out the most about these satellites was the fact that they were moving in retrograde orbit, or backwards against the rotational direction of the Earth, rather than the much easier prograde orbit that would become the standard used by the vast majority of all 3,000 plus satellites currently in orbit. Prograde is used largely because of the added velocity and fuel required to overcome the Earth's rotational forces on launch to adjust into a position and to reach their proper orbit if you're trying to use retrograde. After this story ran and the subsequent investigations were launched, It's been reported that the Pentagon was none too happy about it being made public, and quickly went to work on a cover story that the objects were in fact just asteroids, which would have made for a more believable cover story had it not been for the fact that they were in retrograde orbit as well as near-perfect polar orbit, a feat that wouldn't be accomplished until the 60s at the earliest, and is typically reserved for reconnaissance and Earth mapping or Earth observation satellites. Bear in mind, again, this was 1954, before Sputnik 1 or 2 had ever been launched, and well before anything was successfully put into retrograde or polar orbit. This allegedly sent a wave of panic through the Pentagon that Russia had already put a satellite into orbit and beat the US at the space race. And while those fears would be abated for the time being, just 3 years later, it would truly be realized when on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets would successfully launch Sputnik 1, making it the first artificial satellite to be placed into Earth's orbit. It couldn't have come at a worse time, as Cold War tensions were already high, and the space race was as hotly contested as the arms race at that time. This event sent shockwaves of fear throughout Washington and the U.S. population as a whole, and it fed the fear that the Soviets had been generally outpacing the U.S. military in the area of new technology. At this point in history, the arms race was already reaching new heights. Nazi Germany, with the help of Wernher von Braun, a Nazi rocket scientist, who was later smuggled into the U.S. under Operation Paperclip to become the head of the U.S. rocket program, and whom multiple areas of Huntsville, Alabama, a town near me, which I've actually lived in before, are named after. Anyway, von Braun and the Nazis were dangerously close to developing the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile when the Second World War had come to an end, and Nazi scientists were smuggled away by both countries to continue their work and aid them in developing their own ICBMs. Both countries were also engaged in developing satellite technology as the next phase of the space race, part of a goal from the International Council of Scientific Unions, who had called for the launch of satellite technology during late 1957 or 58. Over the course of the 50s, the U.S. had tested multiple variations of rockets and missiles, all of which had, at this point, been failures. Sputnik was just the latest in a series of technological achievements by Russia. They would also follow this up by launching 2 additional satellites. Sputnik 2 even carried with it a dog into space. R.I.P. Laika, they did you dirty. Sputnik 1 and 2 orbited the Earth every 90 minutes, and the fears they created were worsened when the U.S. learned that Russia had also tested the first ICBM that year as well. Meanwhile, despite pouring even more funding into the project, on December 6th of 57, the U.S. watched as the launch of their first satellite, Vanguard, haplessly exploded on the launch pad. On January 31st, the U.S. would finally get it right when Explorer was successfully launched into space. To bring this back around to our Black Knight, though, before Discovery and even before Sputnik 2, it was reported that an unknown object had been, quote, shadowing Sputnik 1. This object continued to pique the interest of astronomers the world over, and in 1960 was once again located in polar orbit, with astronomers, scientists, and even the U.S. Navy's Dark Fence radar system allegedly detecting the large black-looking object in polar orbit and calculating its weight based on its size, possible makeups, and orbital location as being as much as 15 tons. Making the object far larger than anything the US or Russia could possibly put into orbit at this time. Soon after, the Smithsonian Observatory at Harvard, as well as Grumman Aircraft Corporation in New York, would also detect and photograph the unknown satellite, as well as start a committee to study it, giving yet another boost to its credibility. Then, in 1963, accomplished astronaut Gordon Cooper supposedly reported seeing a green light in front of his Mercury 9 capsule on his final orbit, and that it appeared to be closing distance. The report would go to the Machia tracking station in Australia, who would also pick up the object on radar moving east to west, retrograde. This was reported by NBC, but upon Cooper's return, reporters were told that they were not allowed to ask Cooper about the object. The official explanation is said to be that he was experiencing high levels of carbon dioxide inside the capsule, which caused him to hallucinate. Make of that what you will, and we will circle back to some of these in next week's BTR, maybe a little bit at the end of this episode. There was one other possible sighting as well about 2 years before Cooper's incident that puts yet another bizarre sighting on the books. In 1961, the French Space Commission made an observation of the object while Jacques Vallée was employed there. Despite the team's excitement around the discovery and the intrigue it inspired, Vallée claims that a senior member of the commission deleted all data and imaging of the satellite for unknown reasons. Vallée, who would go on to become a famed ufologist, would later say that he believed that this was done out of embarrassment over the commission's inability to properly identify or explain the object. And of course, as with any story like this, there are other accounts that say that the recorded footage was, in fact, not deleted, but confiscated by NASA, which has only served to further the belief of those in the UFO research community that NASA is actively working to hide any and all UFO or Black Knight satellite evidence from the public. Aside from the strangeness around Gordon Cooper's widely reported sighting in '63, just 2 years later, NASA would have yet another astronaut encounter to try to explain away, when the command pilot of Gemini 4, Major James McDivitt, would report seeing a long, white, cylindrical object with protruding angular arms flying close to his capsule while he was passing over Hawaii. Critics would suggest that what McDivitt saw was just a discarded second stage of the Titan rocket, but upon being shown photos of the second stage, McDivitt outright dismissed this possibility, telling UFO skeptic Philip Klass, quote, "I am sure that this is not a photograph of the object which I have described many times," end quote. In 1969, astronauts aboard what is arguably the most famous spaceflight yet, Apollo 11, reported seeing something outside of the module's window. Early in their journey, Buzz Aldrin described what appears to be a glowing object tracking Apollo's path. At the time, NASA kept a tight lid on the encounter, and the astronauts only make a vague reference to it in their communications. In 2005, though, Aldrin was quoted as saying, quote, "There was something out there, close enough to be observed, and what could it be?" Now, obviously, the three of us weren't going to blurt out, "Hey Houston, we've got something moving alongside of us, and we don't know what it is, you know?" End quote. According to Cooper, encounters like these are common and well documented at NASA, but are always kept secret. Part 3. Contact. In 1973, our story takes yet another wild turn, perhaps the strangest turn of all, and it all starts with a Scottish man named Duncan Lunan. At 13, Lunan traveled to South Uist, the second largest island of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, to witness firsthand the test launch of an American MGM-5 Corporal that the British had purchased and was the nation's first nuclear-armed missile. He was successfully able to watch the launch along with senior NATO military leaders, but upon returning home he would be interrogated by Scottish Office, MI5, Army Intelligence, as well as the CIA in an attempt to figure out how a 13-year-old was able to gain access to the secret launch site, a site that was under close surveillance by Russia. This event was a catalyst of sorts for young Duncan and led to a lifelong fascination with astronautics and astronomy. He would graduate in '68 with a bachelor's degree from the University of Glasgow and earned an MA with honors in English and philosophy, as well as a postgraduate diploma in education. Lunan was a founder of ASTRA, or the Association in Scotland to Research into Astronautics, whose aim, as stated in Article 3 of their Memorandum of Association, is to, quote, "promote the advancement of knowledge and the spread of education, and particularly the dissemination of knowledge on space activities in all branches of science pertaining to such activities, and to stimulate public interest therein," end quote. Or, as it's stated on their website, with two objectives: one, to further develop the public's interest in every aspect of space and space research, and two, to undertake research provided that it is practical and possible. Though all of that may sound somewhat vague or even just convoluted, Astra has actually had some significant contributions to the realm of science, and actually had some very influential and significant members, including Gordon Ross, who is the one that solved the problem of subsonic flight stability, and other notable scientists in the fields of aeronautics and astronautics, as well as aerodynamics, to name but a few. Lunan was also the manager of the Glasgow Park Department's astronomy project, which was responsible for building the Sighthill Stone Circle. which became the first astronomically aligned megalith built in Britain in over 3,000 years. Lunin is also a founder and current member in the Glasgow Science Fiction Writers Circle. In 1973, Duncan would leap to notoriety when he submitted an article in Spaceflight, a magazine published by the British Interplanetary Society, claiming that he had discovered something while reviewing data gathered by a joint Norwegian and Dutch research project that was studying the same long-delay echoes that we spoke of earlier in this episode. It was his assertion that it had been caught in the late 20s, but was simply overlooked. Within the echo sequence, he discovered a message, or so he says, that appears to be coming from an object at the L5 Lagrange point in the same orbit as the Moon, which he believes to be some sort of a space probe, though doesn't specifically name the Black Knight satellite, as it was actually already known and had been called at this point. By converting the numerical sequence into letters and plotting a series of dots, he was able to decipher not only a message but also a star map of the Epsilon Boötis star system, which consists of a pair of stars that can be seen by the naked eye at night and appear to orbit each other over the period of at least 1,000 years. When he plotted the star system, according to his calculations, it was evident what it was trying to be, but it didn't quite line up with how it looks now. But by essentially rewinding the precession of the zodiac, it was being broadcast in a position that last lined up about 13,000 years ago, leading him to believe that this quote-unquote probe has likely been in orbit around the Earth for at least 13,000 years. When he interpreted the message into letters, his conclusion was that it said, quote, "Start here. Our home is Epsilon Boötis, which is a double star. We live on the sixth planet of 7, coming from the Sun, which is the larger of the two. Our sixth planet has 1 moon. Our fourth planet has 3. Our first and third planets each have 1. Our probe is in the position of Arcturus, known in our maps." End quote. This claim would also be reported in Time magazine, CBS Evening News, and was included in the Rod Serling 1975 documentary In Search of Ancient Mysteries, as well as on George Norrie's Coast to Coast AM radio program. The message was refuted by many scientists and even at one time retracted by Lunin himself. In 1998, however, he reinterpreted part of it and claimed support coming from positional astronomy. It was Lunin's calculations that have been used to claim that the BKS is at least 13,000 years old, despite Lunin himself never attributing the signal to the Black Knight directly, and at times stating that he wanted nothing to do with the Black Knight satellite. The major source of tying Lunin's translation to the BKS came from none other than our old friend from Season 2, Episode 5, author John Keel, in his 1995 book, Disneyland of the Gods, where he would report on Lunin's translation and assertion that it was coming from the strange Black Knight satellite, retelling that it was in fact the probe Lunin spoke of and that it was 13,000 years old, adding that it was here to, quote, keep watch on Earth and to relay information back to Epsilon Boötis. This book would only serve to further muddy the waters and become yet another misplaced element in the growing lore of the Black Knight satellite. Lunin wasn't the first to put forward theories about an alien probe being the most likely first step in contact, though. The most interesting of these comes from Professor of Electrical Engineering of the Space, Telecommunications, and Radio Science Laboratory at Stanford University, and well-respected award-winning scientist Ronald Bracewell. His theory, which now bears his name, is the Bracewell probe hypothesis. Bracewell proposed that such a probe would be constructed as an autonomous robotic interstellar space probe with advanced levels of AI, as well as all relevant information that its home civilization might wish to communicate. It would be then sent to seek out other technologically advanced civilizations, or just to monitor worlds with a potential for advanced civilizations to arise, and then communicate over shorter distances than its parent civilization would have to, once it discovered a civilization that met its criteria. It would then make its presence known and carry out a dialogue, bridging the gap between the two civilizations and acting essentially as an autonomous representative of its home planet. Mathematician John von Neumann had also proposed the concept of a self-replicating spacecraft or probe, now known as the von Neumann probes or von Neumann machines. as being the most efficient way to spread out and explore space, or just to mine entire galaxies by taking advantage of their potential for exponential growth. This is actually a whole other rabbit hole in itself, but given that the two concepts are compatible and not mutually exclusive, a self-replicating device as proposed by von Neumann would greatly speed up a Bracewell probe search. It is also possible that a von Neumann Bracewell probe could outlive its parent civilization. Bracewell's paper on the topic from 1960 also discusses the long delay echo phenomenon as potential evidence for such a probe's existence. Discovered by American astronomer James Scott on November 6 of 1991, near-Earth object 1991 VG was initially suspected as a possible candidate for a Bracewell probe due to its strange characteristics such as its uncertain origin and the rapid variation in the object's brightness, as well as how it seemingly disappeared from 1992 until 2017 when it returned to the vicinity of Earth for the first recorded time in 26 years. At which time it was considered to be a faint but potentially threatening near-Earth object until its orbit was established with high precision. A low-cost CubeSat solar sail spacecraft from NASA, known as the Near-Earth Asteroid Scout, was constructed with 1991 VG as its planned target. Before its launch, however, another object, 2020 GE, would become its new target. It was successfully launched into heliocentric orbit on November 16th of 2022, where it would immediately go dark with contact impossible to establish and was quickly considered lost only 2 days after being launched. Part 4. New Evidence. In 1998, just 2 years after the infamous STS-75 tether incident that many believe gave the world a first-hand glimpse of alien craft swarming a NASA shuttle, images taken by the Space Shuttle Endeavour on STS-88 of what it would later label as, quote, space junk, would cause a huge stir in the UFO community and once again reignite curiosity and discussion around the Black Knight satellite. Those images are posted on our Facebook page if anyone hasn't seen them, with one being used in the episode art for this episode actually. What it appears to show is a large object with estimates of its weight matching the 10 to 15 ton weight given to the BKS before. The object appears to be three-dimensional, with angles and protrusions and possibly small lights being visible in one area. These photos would circulate rapidly, far and wide, and be pointed to as a long-awaited visible confirmation of the Black Knight floating above Earth. Shortly after, the series of photos would apparently disappear from the NASA archives, which only served to cause more suspicion. As of my writing of this, though, I can say with certainty that at least one of these photos can still be found on NASA's archive site. Whether it was ever removed and just re-uploaded is, to me at least, unknown. With all the excitement caused by these photos, NASA would quickly go into debunk mode and issue statements to explain it away. One said it was likely debris that had escaped when a hatch was opened for a spacewalk. One said it was simply space junk, which is what the most famous photo is still labeled as on NASA's website. When those were met with suspicion and criticism, though, a final explanation would be issued. This one says that while the International Space Station was under construction, NASA had sent a shuttle mission to help with the construction process. This shuttle brought with it, among other things, 4 thermal blanket covers that were meant to insulate the station's trunnion pins, but one of them came loose during a spacewalk by astronaut Jerry Ross, not that one, and floated away into space. The photos, they said, were to document its loss. This would become NASA's final word on the subject and would be used in countless articles to debunk the pictures that were allegedly of the Black Knight satellite. This seemingly worked great, as discussion would slowly die down around it, and anytime the subject would resurface, skeptics and debunkers were quick to rush out the cover excuse to silence any and all speculation. I have to admit, it even worked on me, someone with a more than healthy skepticism of all things government or NASA. That is, until I got curious finally and set out to figure out what exactly a trunnion pin looked like and how big / what shape a cover for one might look like. No surprise, this would prove more difficult than I had imagined, so I pulled up NASA's own archive and eventually came across photos of the real cover from STS-88 as it was floating away, which I've also included on the Facebook page for you to make your own comparison. Needless to say, I failed to see how what is shown in the BKS pictures and the images labeled as being the trunnion pin cover from that very mission on NASA's own website are the same thing. As always though, I've presented the evidence and I will leave that up to you to decide. Part 5. Conclusions. So there it is. As I said at the start, no shortage of opinions and speculation to go around. The question remains though, how much of it is real and how much is just pure speculation, or mixed up pieces that have somehow found their way into the mythos of the Black Knight over the years? Well, that's a great question, and there really isn't a simple or satisfying answer to it, unfortunately. Some things are just simply impossible to definitively prove or disprove, which only further complicates our pursuit of the truth. With that in mind though, rather than waiting and doing it all in the BTR, I'll go ahead and do my best to break down as much as I can here at the end. The Tesla signals have been hotly debated for many years, with both sides presenting decent arguments. It's important to realize though that Tesla never claimed anything regarding his belief that they came from an alien ship or some sort of a probe. It was his belief at the time, a time when he was admittedly already getting into some pretty far out there stuff, that these signals were coming from other planets, aligning with a belief he already held regarding the existence of alien life. While there's no definitive answer to what it was that Tesla was tuning into, the majority of modern scientists and researchers in the field believe that it was coming from quasars. That's a whole other thing to break down and explain, but it's certainly possible. On this one, I tend to have to go with that answer, for now at least, because it's about the best one that we have. As far as the LDEs, or the long delay echoes, being signals rebroadcasted by the Black Knight, this one is at least a little harder to disprove, I'd say. It certainly isn't provable either though, at least at this point in time, but it's just difficult to completely explain away. The truth is, we still don't know with complete certainty what it is that's causing them, but several theories have been put forward. I suppose that until verifiable proof is presented and peer-reviewed, we kind of have to leave this one as undecided. For those curious, I'll give my personal thought on this and others in next week's BTR. As for Donald Kehoe, it depends on who you believe, I suppose. The bit of info I left out was that in 1954 he had already written a book on flying saucers titled Flying Saucers from Outer Space and was promoting it. He had also shot to notoriety as a Navy pilot back in 1950 by claiming that the US was experimenting with UFO technology. On one hand, it's certainly reasonable to say that Kehoe was just a crazy UFO conspiracist. And I have very little doubt that at least some of you are probably going to be inclined to lean that direction. And that seems to be the position of many. However, on the other hand, if you believe that something alien indeed crashed 3 years before he mentioned the US experiments in Roswell, New Mexico, then it certainly isn't that big of a stretch to believe that he was actually just a much maligned whistleblower who was willing to speak out at great risk to his career. Whether or not what he reported applied to the actual Black Knight or not, though, that part's impossible to know. He clearly felt, or at least claimed, that it was one or two artificial satellites, but I found it virtually impossible to track those claims back to White Sands. And what I have found was a single denial that they were ever investigating such a thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't, of course. I've pointed out probably 100 examples at least of one element or another within the government lying about or denying proven events just over the course of this podcast alone. So I have a hard time simply taking their word for it. I'm just saying that I was unable to find verifiable evidence to support his claims as well. As for the claims of an object being in polar orbit in 1960 goes, this story has a few turns to it before we can really get anywhere close to the truth. Initially, Time magazine reported that the U.S. Navy,
Hoorah, Navy,
had detected a dark object suspected of being a Soviet spy satellite. The military would quickly contact Time magazine and insist that they run a follow-up stating that it had been identified as the remains of the Air Force's Discoverer 8 satellite that had gone astray and had basically become a chunk of space debris. Well, that settles it. Mystery solved, right? It certainly seemed to at the time. Despite the polar orbit, it moving twice as fast as any other satellite, its size being estimated between 10 to 15 tons, its east to west movement, people reportedly spotting it all over the world as a visible red light moving quicker than all the other satellites, and everything else that prompted the Grumman Aircraft Corporation to form a committee to study the data received from all available observations. The committee was formed for the record, but none of their findings were ever made public. The mystery would endure at least until 1995, when documents were declassified by Clinton that finally disclosed that the Discoverer program was actually just a cover for a top-secret project that was a joint operation between the CIA, Air Force, and private industry, codenamed the Corona Project. What it was in reality is an American spy satellite program to gather photographic intel on the Soviets and to take a peek behind their Iron Curtain. Despite it racking up 13 failed attempts at completing the mission, the first successful recovery of film from space took place on August 18, 1960, less than 2 years after Eisenhower formally endorsed the project in February of '58. In its first successful flight, the effort and persistence paid off, with it collecting a reported 3,000 feet of film covering 1,650,000 square miles of Soviet territory. This would lead to the U.S. discovering that there was indeed a missile gap, but heavily in the favor of the U.S., and that the Soviets had greatly exaggerated their military capabilities. This revelation greatly altered the course of the Cold War, and has been cited as being instrumental in keeping the U.S. back from the nuclear threshold. While I, of course, can't say for sure that this explains away all of the sightings and investigations into the object during this time frame, it is at least the most likely explanation for some of the reports, if nothing else. The sighting by Gordon Cooper may or may not have ever happened. The logs that I was able to get my hands on for the Mercury mission seem to either not contain it or it's been redacted, and Cooper has on more than one occasion denied that it ever happened. There are some kernels of truth to it. The Mercury Atlas 9 launched Cooper into space in his capsule, which he had named Faith 7. This was a first-of-its-kind extended orbit mission in an attempt to catch up to the Soviets, who at this point had flown several multi-day flights. To accommodate this feat, several changes were made in an effort to extend his trips around the Earth. Some worked, and some didn't. From temperature regulation issues requiring manual adjustments of his spacesuit the entire time, to temp and carbon dioxide spikes inside the capsule on the 19th orbit, there were definitely some complications to say the least. By his 20th orbit, Cooper had lost all readings indicating the altitude or orientations of the spacecraft, as its electrical system were failing. On the 21st orbit, the automatic stabilization and control system failed completely. It was a harrowing flight back home, to say the least, and CO2 levels were definitely running very high, so part of the story checks out. Cooper was a believer in UFOs, and although he denied rumors about seeing one on the Mercury 9, he did claim to have seen several in 1951 while he was an Air Force pilot flying over Germany. And these were widely reported by pilots, and they called them Foo Fighters. Foo being a nonsense word from the 30s that is credited to cartoonist Bill Hallman in his Smokey Stover cartoons. Then it was borrowed by a radar operator in the 415th Night Fighter Squadron named Donald J. Myers, who was by all accounts a fan of the comic and began using the term to describe the unidentified balls of light that were being so widely reported at the time. Anyways, if Cooper ever said that he saw something, it was likely that he thought it was a UFO anyway, and any evidence of him reporting it has seemingly been lost to the ages. The story with Duncan Lunan I pretty much discussed a minute ago. He openly disavowed any involvement with this translation having anything to do with the Black Knight, and despite seeing multiple articles stating that he had retranslated it, I never found this new translation anywhere. He has reportedly stated he wanted nothing to do with the BKS though. Now, on to my favorite bit of evidence, the STS-88 photos. If you've followed along from the pictures on the Facebook page or in the Discord, then you've been able to see this object for yourself and compare it to the thermal cover. Well, I suppose there is a vague bit of resemblance, just given the fact that, admittedly, I don't know what an object like that is supposed to look like in the vacuum of space, or how it would or wouldn't reflect light and or the darkness of space. What I do know is that there are inconsistencies in the story and measurable differences that we can at least dig into. The official explanation says that astronaut Ross finished his assigned spacewalk or extravehicular activity early and was asked to cover the space station's trunnion pins with thermal covers. Ross was asked to complete this as a free-floating task, and he failed to properly secure it, thus leading to it floating off into space, where NASA says it eventually made it to Earth and burned up harmlessly in the atmosphere. When Ross was later asked which pin he lost the cover to, he said that he couldn't remember, and he was just too upset with himself to think about it. Fair enough, I guess. I mean, if I made a mistake that bothered me that much, every detail of it would likely be seared into my brain for years to come. But everyone is different, and that in itself isn't enough to invalidate NASA's cover story, if you will. When you begin to really dig into the size of the cover versus the object, though, this is where things start to get more interesting. While in most of the pictures it is difficult to determine the actual scale of the object, there is one image that shows it some distance below the space shuttle. Bear in mind, these thermal covers are fairly small, usually with the biggest accounts I've found saying that they can be up to 6 feet or so squared. Even without taking the perspective, the object appears at least some distance further away than the shuttle in the picture that I'm talking about. It seems to be about as long as the shuttle's cargo door, which was 60 feet long, or in other words, at least 10 times bigger than the largest estimates about the thermal covers. Still though, there's a pretty decent degree of variance from picture to picture, suggesting that whatever was photographed is either some sort of flexible, amorphous object, or that the BKS is able to either change its form in some way or at least appear pretty different depending on the angle that it is viewed from. As far as my personal opinion regarding the space blanket explanation, that isn't what it looks like to me. I mean, personally, whatever it is, it appears to have like mass and be a three-dimensional object as far as I can tell. Again though, I am no expert on these matters, and I acknowledge that there is a pretty wide knowledge gap there, so I'll leave that one up to you. Depending who you ask or what you read, there is either a ton of evidence going back through time about the BKS, or there's none at all. Lunan has gone back and forth on the thing, but seemed to think that this quote-unquote probe wasn't in the orbit of the Earth, but in the Moon's orbit. After disavowing all connection to the Black Knight, and even the Epsilon Boötis, his most recent work I was able to find has him claiming the alignment of several ancient sites also point towards the Epsilon star system. I'll give you my full honest thoughts in the BTR next week, but I just wanted to give you a little personal insight while sticking to the facts in this episode. So that way you would have all the information possible, hopefully, to make your own decision on the validity of the Dark Knight satellite. Above all, it's a fascinating story, if nothing else, which is why so many continue to talk, write, and investigate on the subject. Ultimately, if the Black Knight is truly an ancient probe, or just a piece of space junk, is for you to decide. What I can say, given how UFOs tend to show up whenever nuclear arms are active, it would seem that whomever or whatever may be watching us has a vested interest in us not destroying ourselves. Given that we are closer to nuclear war today than nearly any other time in history, if it is real, and it is watching us, looking for the right time to make contact, there's as likely a chance as ever that we will be hearing from it any day now. So, if you look up at the sky tonight and see something strange drifting by, you might as well wave hello, because you never know if tonight's the night that it finally decides to wave back. And that's pretty much going to do it for tonight's deep dive into the Black Knight satellite. I'm kind of proud of myself for somehow getting through this all without a single Monty Python reference. Or did I? I really hope that you all enjoyed this episode. Thank you for bearing with me throughout these recent weeks and Still playing the smaller news update episodes, as well as some of you going back and replaying some of the older ones. It is sincerely appreciated. It's tough to keep the numbers up without doing, weekly drops, so thank you for the continued support that you've shown. I got our Spotify Wrapped for creators the other day, and I'll be sharing that with you in next week's BTR too. But in a nutshell, what it shows is a ton of growth over the season. And considering I do really nothing to promote this show, and have never paid a penny to advertise it, I have to really give you guys the credit for that, and just know that it is all sincerely appreciated as well. But that's really all I've got for you this evening. I hope that you all are doing well out there, and that you were able to have a great Thanksgiving for all my U.S. listeners. I'll be back with you next week, like I said, for an exciting BTR, but until then, be sure to take care of yourselves, look after one another when you can, and I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.